Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the routing of our new Blazor app. So we're going to create a new template and just look at how does this actually work. We're going to pull it apart and see, okay, where's the starting point for our application? How does it know how to get pages? How do we tell pages when to show up and where to show up? And all that good stuff. Basically, we need to know how to make our system work with new pages especially. Okay, so let's go over to Visual Studio, create a new project. It's in my recent project template list. I'm going to just double click it here. And let's call this, we're going to call it Blazor app, the product name, but the solution name we'll call routing demo. That way if you install or extract these zip files with the source code, you can see the different ones, but we don't have to keep creating new names for product names when the reality is they're just demos. Hit create. Blazor server-side app.NET Core 3.1. We do want HTTPS, but no authentication at this point. Hit create. And it creates for us our Blazor app. And so now this is created, and it is the correct Blazor app. Then we're going to look at, okay, so when I hit run, this thing loads up a web page, but how does it know to go there? How does it know what's the home page? Okay, so let's start with program.cs, which may sound familiar if you've ever used a console app. In fact, if we right-click on Blazor app project, go to properties, the output type is a console application, which seems a little weird because we're actually building a web application. But the reality is, the way this is built is basically a console application. So we have program. Inside there we have a static void main. This is where our application starts, because that's where all console applications start, is at the static void main. So right away, we create host builder, which we're going to cover more, but this is what starts, and it's okay, well, you build the host builder, and then run it. So that's where we're actually running our applications right there. Well, the create host builder method is right down here. And it says, okay, host create default builder. So basically give us the defaults, the starting point for all ASP.NET Core applications. And then from there, configure web host defaults, which is to use for the startup class. Okay, so that's the starting point. So when we create this host builder, then you build it and you run it, we're saying, okay, I want you to run this as the startup. Well, a startup is a class inside of startup.cs class. So you go over there, and this is the class that's going to run. So first of all, this is where all the really good configuration stuff happens for our application. And we'll talk about some of that stuff later in our section on included systems. For example, this is where we do dependency injection. And then we also have in here configuration for our talking to our app settings.json. And we'll cover all of that. But let's look down here under the configure method. Now in here, there's some stuff on error handling, which again, we're going to cover in 2 lessons from now in the error handling lesson. But then down here, we have use routing. So it sets up some defaults for ASP.NET Core. But then afterwards, we have use endpoints. And this is where we configure what that routing is going to look like. And one of those endpoint configurations is map Blazor hub. This is where we configure our SignalR connection. Now, SignalR, as we discussed, is what powers our Blazor server app. So SignalR is a service that talks to the client browser and says, okay, here are the things that have changed. And then it listens for any changes coming back the other direction. This is what makes it look like and really act like a single page application or a SPA. That SignalR connection is what allows us to talk between the two. The great thing is this just works. That's all the configuration we have to do for SignalR. It's all kind of hidden behind the scenes, and it just works for us. So there's not a lot to do there. But then we have this endpoints.map fallback to page, and the page to fall back to is /_host. So this is a fallback in case we don't know where we're going. Well, how do we know where we're going? Well, actually, by default, host is where we're going. Let's look at where host is. Under pages, there is _host.cshtml. Notice this is a little bit different than the rest of these. The rest of these end with .razor, but _host is a CSHTML file. This is really a starting point for your application. This is what it's pointing to as the place for your page to load. So let's open it up. Notice this looks an awful lot like a standard HTML page. We have the doc type HTML, we have the default language, we have the header, and we have down here the body. So this is a pretty standard HTML page, but it does have some additional things. For example, all of this stuff at the top is all extra, and this is all Blazor stuff. Now, we're going to cover some of it later, but let's look right here at page, and it says just /. This is indicating this is the starter page, but also what page to call by default. So you don't have anything, we're going to call the starter page, which is just /. All right, so then down here, we'll come back to the rest of this in a minute, but down here, we'll notice that we have in the body section, this app. And this is where our actual rendering of our pages will happen. If this was Razor pages, you would see an @render body here, but this is a bit different. What this says is this is our application section right here. We're going to have a component, and the type of the component is called app. And we're going to render it in server pre-rendered, which means we're going to render it on the server and then pass it down to the client. We're going to build it on the server first. Okay, so what is this? Well, app is actually short for app.razor right down here. This is where we have our layout for our routing. Now, if you're thinking that so far we're kind of going down the rabbit hole of 2, 3, 4 steps in a row just to put something on the page, you're right. And in fact, I have said a number of times, we'll get to that later, which may feel a little frustrating. And I'm sorry for that, but I'm going to try and focus in on one topic at a time so you can come back and watch it later and get just that topic if you need to. But don't worry, we're going to cover it all. We're going to cover it all in a logical manner. Now, as for why this is stacked so deeply, it's because the Razor pages, actually Blazor itself, is a little different than Razor pages in the fact that it's much more component based. Everything is a component and you compose components together. Think of them like Lego bricks, and you're putting bricks together to make a larger shape, which then you may take that larger shape and put it with more larger shapes to make an even larger shape. That's what we're doing in Blazor. So, when we have on the host.cshtml file, we say, hey, our app, it's a component. What's the component? App.razor. Here's the component, and this component says, hey, if you have found the route data, then go ahead and display that. But if you have not found the route data, then display this, which says, sorry, there's nothing at this address. Now note, if you remember from last lesson, we actually went to a page called /demo that wasn't there. And we got this message, sorry, there's nothing at this address. That's where that error message came from, because we did not find the route. And so therefore, we displayed instead this information. Now, just like Razor pages, Blazor pages have the concept of a layout page. And what that is there's a default layout, and then you just put your content inside of it. So when we have this not found here, what happens is we're going to display just this code right here. And so we want to use the default layout of main layout. Now, if we do find the route, then we're going to display that route data, which is the entire page, including the layout page. However, if that page does not have a layout page, this default layout here says, well, the default is going to be main layout. So that's why these two are here. You can change these if you want to. If you want to change this one, or maybe just the not found layout to be something totally different, you can do that. But this allows you to say what your default layout is up here, and down here, what the layout is going to be for your error page. Which, that's not exceptions, that's just if you go to a route that does not exist. Okay? And we're going to cover error handling in another lesson. We'll get there. But I just want to show you this page and why it's important. App.razor allows us to make choices about what happens if we find a route or we don't find a route. So while it does add an extra layer in our chain of who's hooking up who and where, it allows us to be more flexible in how we design our application. So this is a good thing. It's just, again, an extra layer. So we start at host.cshtml. We go to app. And then app says, okay, whatever the route is that you've passed in, display that if it exists. And if it doesn't, display the error message. So where do those routes come from? Well, they come from the pages themselves. Let's look at index.razor. I'll give you a hint. Index.razor is the starting page. This is what shows up if you don't put in a route. Now, how do we know where to go here? How do you know index is the right one? Well, at the very top, we have at page, and it's just a slash. That indicates that the path to get here is the root, just slash. So whatever it's localhost 5001 slash, and that's it. That's our route. So it's our main route. So this is where we're going to go if a user says, I don't want to give you, or I'm not giving you a sub page to go to. Let's look at counter. Notice the page is /counter. So if you type in /counter, you will go to this page. All right. And then we have our fetch data, which is /fetch data. So we have our default, which is index. That's our home page essentially. And then we have our counter or other style like this, where we say / in the path to the page. Now let's go to the fetch data page. What if we wanted to say, you know what? This is really weather data. And so I want to call this /weather instead. But maybe we're already using /fetch data. We have links to it. So we want to have it go to /weather, but we don't want to break those old links. Or maybe we just have two different URLs that make sense to users. So /fetch data makes sense to some users, /weather makes sense to other users. In that case, we can actually apply more than one route. So at page, and let's give it a new route, weather. So now I have two routes on this page, /fetch data and /weather. Which one will it use? Whichever one you specify. So let's run this, and let's use the Kestrel version. So once this loads up, what we're going to do is we're going to use the navigation, which is going to go to /fetch data. So right here, notice fetch data. But if I go off this page and I just type in here weather, hit enter, notice it goes to the weather page. Now over here on the left, we don't have one of the items lit up. That's because this URL does not match what fetch data is. Now notice if I go to counter, notice counter stays lit up because it matches as /counter. If I go to fetch data, it stays lit up because it's /fetch data. I will show you, again, in a future video, but I will show you how to configure that so that you know what to light up. So in this case, we could light up weather instead of fetch data. But that's how you do multiple routes on one page. You don't have to be stuck with just one. Now don't go crazy here, because you could put 30 or 40, but that doesn't make sense. But this does allow you to have more than one route and yet have just the one page to service both of them. All right? And you can even determine which page you're looking at, even though it's the same page, but which URL you used. Now, what if you want to pass data across to a page? For example, right now the counter page starts off at 0 and it increments the count when you push the button. Again, let's launch that real quick so you can refresh your mind as to what it does. So when we go to the counter page, we have the current count of 0, and whenever I click me, it goes up by 1. That's the counter page. But what if you want to pass in an initial value to this counter page? Well, I'd have two options here. One is I could just change the page URL, but then I have to change my navigation, and maybe I don't want to do that. It makes sense to have your /counter if you don't have a default value. But if you do have a default value, go ahead and pass it in. So I can add a new page directive, and I can say /counter/ and then inside of curly braces, I can give it a name. Let's give it a name of starter value and say it's an int. Now, you get to choose whatever the name is you use here. This is the type. And the types you can use are bool, date time, decimal, double, float, GUID, int, and long. Those are the ones that are supported. In this case, I'm going to pass in an int value. So I'm going to say this starter value is the value the counter should start at. Make sense? Okay, so right now it's starting at 0. Well, how do I capture this value first of all? What you need is a property. And yes, we're going to make it public. And the name of it is going to be starter value. This is where you match up this right here with this down here. So we're matching up the property name to whatever our route says we're expecting. Okay? Which is why this is a capital letter, because I want to match that to my public property. So now we'll be passing the value, whatever the value is after the slash, if it's an integer, we'll match that up with our property after we make one more change, which is to say, hey, this property is a parameter. And you put that in square brackets right above your property. All right, so now we have that value, but how do we assign it to our current count? We can't just assign it right here. That won't work. It'll throw an error. The thought might be to call or to set up a constructor and then have the constructor assign the value to the current count. But that also won't work. And the reason why is because the value of starter value will be 0, or the default value, when you are in the constructor. But never fear, protected override, you have a few options here. And one of them is on parameters set. So once the parameters are set, you can call this method. Now, if you have some type of database call or other call that needs to be asynchronous, I would encourage you to use on parameters set async. But since I have nothing I'm going to be doing that is asynchronous, I'll just use on parameters set. And this creates for me, and it kind of messes up my formatting when I do that. Let's fix that for us. There we go. So on parameters set is going to run, if we mouse over, it says when the components have received parameters from its parent in the render tree. and the incoming values have been assigned to the properties. So essentially, once this is populated, then this will run. So after base on parameter set, in case there's anything in there that we want to actually have run, we're going to say, I don't think there is, but leaving this does not hurt. So I'm going to say that the current count equals starter value. Now you may ask, isn't that going to override a value? And the answer is no. This does not get set every single time. It only gets set when you make the initial call to this page. If the value is not set, for example, you go to /counter, then even if this runs, the starter value will be 0, the default for an integer. Therefore, it's going to put 0 into an already 0 value. It causes no harm. Now, we can run this code. So now if we go to the counter page, it's 0. We go to fetch data. Let's change the counter and say /25. Now we go to the counter page, but notice the current count is 25. If I hit click me, I can still change that value even though the URL says /25. That was the starter value. Now, you don't have to change the same parameter that's shown on the screen. It could be a ID lookup for a user, or it could be something totally different. But this allows you to pass values into your pages, or essentially what are pages. Now, there's one thing I haven't shown you yet, and you may wonder, you may say, Tim, there's a disconnect here somewhere. Because what I showed you is that whenever you say /counter, it goes to this page. But you're saying, Tim, I'm seeing more stuff on the screen than what's here. And I talked about it briefly, but I want to mention this. I will cover this more in depth when we discuss the default layouts and creating our own layouts for pages. However, what this is doing right now is using the default layout since there is no layout specified. So if we go to the main layout.razor under shared, this is the layout page. And you may say, well, Tim, how do you know that this is the layout page being called? Remember back in app.razor, we call the routing. If we do not have a layout, the default layout is main layout, which is this page right here. We haven't specified in fetch data or in counter a different layout page. Therefore, we're using the default. So in here is where we have our sidebar with our nav menu, and we have our main, which is where we have some basic information like about, and then also down here we have our @body, which is similar to the @render body you will see in a Razor page. So that's the layout. Again, we're going to cover this more in depth, but I did want to make sure I pointed that out because it does feel a little bit like a disconnect if you're not seeing why the whole thing gets rendered this way. And this is why. This is the default for rendering a page. So that's it for this lesson. We covered how the program.cs starts everything off. Which is /counter/sample/demo, which is a 3-nested deep page. If we run this and I pass in this URL, it will go to the counter page. So let's just keep it up here. So I need to go to /counter/sample/demo, and that takes us to the counter page. So this URL can be pretty much anything you want it to be. All we need to do is specify a route for it. So that's our routing in a nutshell. We have simple routing, we have routing with parameters, and we even have the concept of changing what our parameters are or what information we pass in and how that works. That's probably a lot more than you wanted to know about routing. But I think it's important to understand all the different pieces that go into this so that you can tweak any one of them. So for example, that app.razor, there's a lot of good stuff you can tweak here. In fact, and this is going to be one important thing to point out, and we'll note this later, when you're using authentication, notice we have not used authentication yet. When you do, it's going to change how this router works. It's going to change some names. We're going to have a few extra pieces in here for authenticated traffic versus unauthenticated traffic, where we send it, how it looks, all that good stuff. And so there's a lot of stuff you can do in here to make your app really shine. But you have to know where it is and how it works before you can do that. So this has been all about routing. Kind of take some notes. Hopefully you took some notes, but kind of take some notes about what you remember, what you want to get more information about, but then make sure you practice what you learned before you come back to the next lesson.